Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. We're back with Access to Democracy. As usual, I'm your host, Alan Miller. We have two academic guests today, one a return guest and one here for the first time, but hopefully not the last time. Zach Sullivan has been here before, faculty member at Inver Hills Community College. And let's tell you a little bit about Zach because we're having some trouble with graphics today. He's currently completing his ED, education doctor, for his doctorate at Hamline. He's taught at several schools in the area, Minnesota colleges and universities. He's also the newly elected grievance rep at the Inver Hills College for the faculty union, and he's very active. He's been both a speaker and very active in grassroots political activity. Very steeped in politics and probably grieving what's happening in the legislature right now, but we'll get to that. Richard Jewell, who is actually in the English department, although he's on sabbatical leave starting a few weeks ago. Richard has a really interesting career because he's also involved in the humanities very deeply and serves both in the English department and the humanities department. Mm-hmm. He's a coordinator of the State College English Conference, mm-hmm. and I think you're a founder of that also.
Correct.
And when I was researching for the show, much to my surprise, I found out that he has authored many texts and websites involving English, another talent that you kept hidden from me. And we have a function called Student Success Day. Mm-hmm. And Richard has coordinated that for the last several years and has been tremendously successful. And in addition to that, he is the advisor to Phi Theta Kappa, the Honor Society. So welcome both.
Thank you.
And you don't need a job this coming semester. You don't know if you're going to have a job this coming semester, as do I, who also teach on a college faculty. So let's talk about that first. Where are we with the shutdown?
Well, the state of Minnesota is likely moving toward a shutdown. It's a much different situation than we saw in 2001 and 2005. 2005, most recently, 6 out of the 10 budget bills were passed and agreed to between the governor and the legislature. This time around, only 1 of 10, and the most minor of the 10 funding the Department of Agriculture. So basically nothing's been done. And state services will shut down July 1st, which could include the Minnesota State College and University system. It would not include the University of Minnesota system initially because their payroll functions are all internal and they depend on a little bit of less resources from the state to operate. So they've got a longer cushion. We can get into whether or not and how this will impact MnSCU, but right now leaders on college campuses are preparing as if it will. And it is possible, though I personally think unlikely, that MnSCU could shut down as of July 1st. Most certainly, there will be a shutdown of a very substantial size impacting the entire state beginning July 1st.
It's very interesting, and we can talk about the legislature, and I have certainly railed on the legislature and their non-focus on higher education. which I think is so detrimental. But the fact of the matter is, if there's a shutdown, there's going to have to be severance paid to thousands and thousands of employees. MnSCU, both Inver Hills and MCTC, where I teach, have sufficient reserves to carry themselves at least until January. And they have to get permission to tap those funds. Now, I don't know the procedure for that. Maybe, Richard, maybe you do. You've been through this before.
No, actually, I haven't been through it before.
You haven't?
Yes, the last time this was a serious concern, I think I was at the University of Minnesota.
And they don't have a concern at the moment.
Correct.
But the fact of the matter is, there could be really tens of thousands of people who are laid off. Ultimately, they're going to have to seek unemployment.
Sure.
Unemployment is certainly going to impact us.
Right.
The state parks will close. Tourism being the second biggest industry in Minnesota, next to agriculture. The Attorney General, who I happened to meet a week ago, told me the impact could be $1 billion a week lost to the state, which is $5 billion in the hole to begin with, and the legislature seems unwilling to compromise with the governor.
Interestingly enough, I mean, MnSCU is better off than a lot of public services. I mean, because MnSCU is largely self-funding, that if the governor agrees, and we can talk about the politics around this if you want, we can work out an arrangement with the Minnesota Management and Budget to, as you said, self-fund through fall semester need be. But boy, I mean, those things you talk about are just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, rest stops, parks, and that's going to hit a lot of people, but everything from patching potholes to, recently we saw concrete or asphalt buckle on 94. Those kind of things are really matters of life or death as to whether or not there is a response to those. The Minnesota Department of Transportation, now it all depends on what's determined essential and non-essential, and that will be determined by a judge advocated by the Attorney General and the Governor's office. But boy, as many as 60,000 public employees, and that's going to have an effect on our court system, mental health system, you name it. And we're in a situation where, yeah, we're dependent more and more on students, and that has a very adverse effect on them. There are a number of public services that don't have those independent revenue streams, and they're in even worse shape.
I mean, we have two parties who claim that they're really interested in education. Nationally, we recognize that education, particularly in Minnesota, has been so important to not only the growth of the state, but maintaining the state as a leader in the country in that regard. But we have one party that doesn't seem to be interested in that at all. They have adopted this Pawlenty false philosophy of no new taxes, but they don't seem to care if they put thousands of people out of work. They don't seem to care that if things are thrown off onto property tax, it's still new taxes. If you add it to fees, it's still new taxes. That the middle class really suffers, and we're talking about them resisting, really, I call it leveling the playing field. The governor is calling it taxing the wealthy. I think that's inappropriate. It's really making the top income earners pay the same as everybody else. And leveling the playing field for the top, someplace between 400 to 2,000 people, will affect 5 million, and yet they're inflexible on it.
Alan, just today there was an article in the Star Tribune that's based on research done over many years that showed that I think in New York, if children go to preschool for 1 to 2 years every day for half a day, that they are much more likely to succeed many years later, about 10% more likely to succeed in getting jobs and not going to jail and staying off welfare.
And Art Rolnick has been advocating this for the last dozen or so years that I'm aware of, and talking about those same statistics, that preschool is so important, or pre-kindergarten is so important to the ultimate education of the student.
And all-day kindergarten, which is something the governor's been
And
advocating.
all-day kindergarten, absolutely, which so many states have.
And I think
states like Alabama have all-day kindergarten.
We have to really differentiate higher ed with K through 12, because when it comes to the raw numbers, the Republicans and Democrats aren't really that far off with when it comes to per pupil expenditure, but how they want to spend that money is different. So of course, from the DFL perspective, the governor's perspective, it's more a focus on early childhood development, focus on all-day kindergarten and other things. On the Republican point of view, it's you get into vouchers, you get into pulling resources out of the public school system, maybe putting them more toward charter schools and so forth. So interestingly enough, the per pupil expenditure is a point of agreement at this point for K through 12, but it's how that's spent is very much up for grabs. And then of course, higher ed, massive differences there, because the Republican legislature is suggesting a 14% reduction, $180 million toward MnSCU, about the same toward the University of Minnesota system, and the governor is suggesting a 6% reduction. So there's a big difference when it comes to higher ed and spending. Not as big of a difference when it comes to K through 12 in spending, but where that money is allocated would be different under each plan.
Now, we hear a lot about overpaid professionals, and we hear a lot about, I mean, here you are still working towards your doctorate, and this is a long educational process. And talking about
Particularly long for me.
hundreds of thousands of dollars. We hear about those things. How many years has it been that salaries have been frozen in MnSCU?
Well, they've been essentially frozen in terms of buying power for about 10 years. And they've been actually frozen since 2007 or so.
Actually frozen, and not even a cost of living increase, not even something to compensate. So the professionals who are teaching in our higher educational MnSCU institutions are earning less money today than they did a decade ago, because they haven't been compensated for cost of living increases, and their actual salaries have been frozen now going into the fourth year. People don't seem to appreciate that.
They're paying more into healthcare as well, so all of us are,
lot
our
more.
co-pays and all that kind of stuff are more.
Alan, I just talked yesterday with a former student of mine who just, she went for 2 years to Inver Hills, and then she graduated just a week or two ago from Hamline University with a bachelor's degree in English. And for the several years I have known her, she, until just recently, had planned to get a PhD in English or psychology, and eventually become a college teacher or university teacher herself. But she has come to the realization that she, if she stays in with just a bachelor's degree, she can get a job in accounting, and her father has an accounting firm, so she can, she's worked with him already, so she's already got herself a very good job, about $30,000 a year, straight out of Hamline University. And she said that in 10 years, if she stays in the business world, she can be making twice as much as a college teacher makes.
And people don't seem to understand that. At least the majority in the legislature don't seem to understand that at all. Now, you had an interesting statistic about how many papers the average English instructor goes over.
People are often concerned that teachers don't work very hard. They see that we are in class for just 15 hours a week, and they think that we must go home and drink coffee after that and watch TV. But instead, in the English profession, we take papers home. And actually, we spend a lot more time in our offices, too, at school, by the way. But I just got done.
You have to have office hours.
You have to have office hours.
That's mandated.
Yes, you're mandated to.
You have department meetings.
Yes.
You have school meetings.
You're mandated to serve, too. So you have school meetings, number of other functions. There are training days, 5 training days a year that you have to attend.
To keep you up with the
Current
latest
teaching.
innovations
That's
in
right.
teaching in your particular.
Yes, which is much more than the private colleges do, by the way, in the University of Minnesota. There's
And the
very
teaching
little
load.
training.
Yeah, the teaching load's higher, and likely, likewise, service and institutional commitments. You bet.
Number of students in a class has gotten larger also.
Yes, in fact, I just recently calculated that due to more efficient crowding of students into classes, that means having fewer classes so that students can't always take the class they want in the semester they want, but there are fewer sections of a class, so students are more crowded into those sections, which is more efficient, admittedly. But that plus the addition of more students, the minimum number of students we're required to take, has meant that each of us as English teachers in my department are teaching at least 20% more than we were even 5 and 6 years ago.
And how many papers do you read a week?
I just got done counting the papers for a typical class, and it's an English teacher in the community college system who's teaching a typical load, which is mostly writing courses, is looking at about 5,000 papers a year. That's how many papers pass through a person's hands.
And these are not handwritten papers. This is 5,000 papers.
They're typed
of
papers.
Multiple pages that have to be read, graded.
Not all have to be graded, some are checked off, but there are probably at least 1,000 that have to be read and graded very carefully.
I know in my Holocaust class, I generally go over cap, so I have 42 students, and when I get those papers, those examinations, I read them twice, because the first time through I'm trying to figure out did everybody get it and where do they fall, and then the second time through read it for grading. So that is a tremendous burden. In the screenwriting classes that I teach at MCTC, and anybody behind the cameras here can tell you, they have to do work every week. So if I'm teaching 2 screenwriting classes, I'm taking that material home every week, figuring out assignments for the new class, and then giving them back, discussing them in class, having office hours, in addition to everything else that goes on in the school. So this fiction about professionals being overpaid is an absurdity by people who are non-professionals and frankly are ignoramuses.
Sometimes I wish I had a job that I could go to for just 40 hours a week. I counted my hours this past year fairly carefully, and I've been spending about 55 hours a week. People say, well, then you have summers off. Well, that's true, but I'm still working 25 hours a week during the summer, and I'm not even getting paid for it.
Now, I saw an interesting statistic also. They had a list of the wealthiest people in Minnesota, the people who have the most money, the people who made the most money this past year. I didn't see any college faculty members on that list. In other words, college faculty is not in there teaching for the money.
Yeah.
College faculty is teaching in their classes because of the desire to impart something to their students to make this world a little bit better.
This is why the discussion is kind of so toxic right now, in my view, is that, first of all, I feel so lucky that I get to do this job. So I want to make sure that that's clear. I mean, those of us who get to teach in the field that they're interested in, I mean, it is a very fortunate thing, and you're putting in all these extra hours because it is a thing you do because it's what you're passionate about. But
and you get it back from the students also.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic gig, but what's disturbing to me this time around is that folks are going after people in public service across the board in the way it reminds me of in the 80s, the notion of sort of the welfare queens. You know what I mean? These are people who are drawing on the state.
They're all
deadbeats,
driving
they're
Cadillacs,
not doing anything. They're
et cetera,
Cadillacs,
yeah.
and it's a fiction. The data's not there. If it is absolutely true that if you compare the average public sector employee and the average private sector employee, the public sector employee makes more money, and that's if you're comparing apples to oranges. But when you isolate a public sector accountant for a private sector accountant, when you look at people by degree level, the fact is those who are in public service on average have higher levels of education, but when you actually isolate it, an attorney for the public, an attorney in the private sector always, and in just about every case, are paid more for the position that they, so that's an erroneous, argument in and of itself. And getting back to my first point real briefly is, I don't even mind so much the discussion that these are tough times, we all have to be part of the solution. We honor your service, we honor what you're doing for the folks at Denver Hills or the folks of the state of Minnesota. But what's problematic this time is that's not the discussion. The discussion's not, hey, we all need to dig in and be part of the solution. The discussion is, you have these fat cats on the public dime, and they are sucking this state dry, and that's just not, the data's not there.
And the fact of the matter is, not only is the data not there, but if you look at the costs and you look at the benefit, the same as
Yes.
pre-K, the benefits so far outweigh the costs.
Right.
You mentioned the fact that health insurance has gotten much more expensive for public employees.
Right.
I think about members of Congress. They get 72% of their excellent health care paid for by us, by the taxpayers. And yet, Congress is resistant to single payer. Congress is resistant to universal health care. The Republican Party in this state is resistant to health care for everyone when we have, I think, thousands. They were ready to drop 110,000 people off of the health care rolls, but the governor would not go along with that. There's a matter of conscience someplace. You take an oath, and it should mean something. I just don't see that with a lot of our public officials.
It's honoring public service, and I think that's something we've got a little bit away from. I mean, it started to decline certainly in the Vietnam and Watergate era, where people start to turn away from public service as inherently corrupt, and that, we've seen that, a loss of trust in public and institutions, and it just shows the sacred trust that we have in our leaders, because when they lose that, it erodes the whole system. You have to take it very responsibly, and I think we're seeing that now with an awful lot of people who, simply saying we're going to go to St. Paul to slay this beast, and that's what we're there to do. And it may be that aspects of this shutdown educate some people as to what government and how government functions.
I would hope so. And I think one other thing we have to mention is that the burden on our students has increased year after year. They're having to pay more.
Yep.
I know that when I go overseas and I talk to the people there about the costs of college here, they say, you mean it's not free? So the Scandinavian countries, things like that, those people don't have to pay for their education, and that's why they are surpassing us in so many fields today. That's making America less competitive in the world. Now, something I wanted to talk to, Richard, you are the advisor for Phi Theta Kappa. Inver Hills, a small college, 6,000 students. There are 700 Phi Theta Kappa organizations throughout the country. Something special happened at Inver Hills this year?
Oh, well, we have 3 advisors. I'm the lead advisor. And our chapter was named a top 100 chapter out of 700 in the nation, which is a great honor. And in our 4-state region, we came in 3rd in the competitions. The Phi Theta Kappa students who are active.
This is the Honor Society. We should make that
yes,
clear.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes, and this is students who not only get in with a very good GPA, but have to maintain that GPA, so the academics still come first for them. But they worked very hard without any kind of pay or return, except the sheer pleasure of learning, to put together 2 major projects that were examples in the region, in our 4-state region.
And I think people also, I think that's extremely commendable. People also have to realize that in this down economy that we've had the last several years, enrollment at the community colleges has gone way up. Why? Because people who lost their jobs, people who are in midlife and going through a cycle where they've lost their jobs, go back to college to get an education. A veteran coming home from Iraq or Afghanistan who has put his or her life on the line to make this a country safer for all of us and better for us, goes to the community college. And we have a big we have a big organization of veterans in the school at both Inver Hills and MCTC, and I know the other schools also. That may not be there for them.
Our colleges are no longer, in the public colleges, especially the two-year colleges, are no longer places where teachers stand in front of the students and lecture to them. Instead, the great majority of teachers are very active in working with students individually and in small groups and in many different situations to help individualize education for each student and help that student get together. Or go forward, I'm sorry.
And let's talk about that burden that you're discussing. An institution like Inver Hills has doubled in size over the last decade. MnSCU itself is meeting the needs of tens of thousands of additional new students at the appropriations they had a decade ago. If we're looking at the proposals for this next budget. So where are those costs going? Obviously they're going to students. It had been that the state of Minnesota was covering roughly 2/3 of the cost of the education for students enrolled in MnSCU institutions. Now that's almost flipped. So now students themselves are covering about 60% of the cost, and what I think is so unfair about that is many of the people who are making these policy decisions enjoyed that subsidy while they went to school,
That's
and then
just
turned
something
right
that
around and didn't pay that forward. And
I was going to bring that up
and that's
because
problematic.
I think that's so important for people to understand, that the people who had the benefits then turn around and get into office and they're taking them away. I had the education, I had a loan, I had a grant, I had this, I had that, but I don't want this generation to have it.
And I don't think
what do
we
you want this generation to do?
We don't sing the public investment in student, we don't explain to them enough. So you have a lot of folks who might end up leaving an institution like the University of Minnesota. Hey, I paid my way through college, I'm a self-made person. To some extent, some of these folks aren't even getting a message that there was an investment made in them. And to that extent, we don't tell our own story very well. We need to do a lot better job of that. And I try to explain that to my students that yes, you're paying these bills, you're borrowing it, and in my view, too much of it. But the state of Minnesota is making an investment in you right now. And there's an awful lot of people who don't know or chose not to know. And it is expensive to continue to pay that forward, but they enjoyed it, and it seems to me they ought to provide it.
Well, having worked with both of you these last few years, I know how much you are a part of the fabric of the institutions that you work for. And I know the job that you do, and I know how important it is to the students, and I get feedback from the students who will talk about this professor or that professor or this dean or that dean, but we won't go into that. And it's so important to them. It's so important to them, just the same as you had the student who graduated 2 years ago it's the same as I got an email from a student who just finished a class with me, thanking me for teaching the class that she could learn something about something she thought was going to be very important for the rest of her life. That's where the rewards are, but you shouldn't have to struggle. You shouldn't have to take a secondary position in life economically to do that. And the shame is that it's not recognized by the people who are in charge. Any last thoughts, Richard?
I'm fine as a Minnesota citizen and helping our whole government pull through. I'm fine with having even more salary freeze, though I've basically been living with that. All have for 10 years now. But why not another few years? But to suggest that I should have my income dropped by 15, 20, 30%, and my retirement benefits as I get closer to retirement seems to me unwise, not just unfair, but unwise for future generations who are going to be taught by the younger teachers.
Well, Richard Jewell and Zach Sullivan will continue this conversation down the road. Hope we don't have to continue it in a shutdown. I thank you for coming in here. We try hard to bring a broad scope of things to our viewers, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.